I've saw all kinds of different medical treatment over the years, so I've kind of experimented in everything. I've definitely done lots of acupuncture, lots of therapy, lots of herbal medicine. But personally, honestly, I really haven't found any modality that specifically works for me. I'll try anything, but nothing seems to have like a miracle result for me. And I made that, it was kind of a joke offhand that about, everything being placebo. But that's partly because I come from like my parents are essentially Christian scientists. They're evangelicals. They don't believe in doctors. They never went to doctors. The problem is right now they don't believe in the pandemic, really. I mean, they're those people that think the pandemic has only really killed 6% of the people that are documented. But yeah, I've only known my parents to go to the doctor like once or twice in my entire childhood. And I think some of that mentality seeped into me of like, oh, doctors aren't real, medicine doesn't work.
Your family's religion was a big part of Blankets, but like, how do they navigate that kind of that dichotomy of being, in a sense, anti-medicine or anti-doctors, and also being so invested or having been so invested in Chinese medicine?
Oh, my parents were not invested in Chinese medicine whatsoever. So they weren't growers of ginseng. My little town in rural Wisconsin was the biggest producer of cultivated American ginseng in the world during my childhood. But it was the farmers that grew ginseng were generally quite wealthy. In fact, our town was known to be full of these sort of working class snobs, people who were not educated. They were farmers, but they were super wealthy, a lot of them millionaires. And I was just like one of the hired hands, as was my mom. That's how we started working in ginseng. Our mom needed supplemental income, so she'd go out and be hired out by farmers to do weeding in the ginseng gardens.
As you detail, she brought you and your brother on board. That wasn't something tricky for them to navigate at all, that relationship?
We had zero curiosity about ginseng and what it was. It was purely a job. It like defined the culture of our hometown, and yet we never gave it a second thought of like, what's this for? Where does it go? It was no more interesting than growing corn growing up.
At what point did you realize that it was a relatively unique experience?
I think it was just at the start of this project. So
as an adult?
Yeah, it was around this like 2011 or 2012. It was 2012, right after my book tour with Habibi wrapped up, and I was fishing around for the next project. That's when I started fiddling with this idea. But I think it must have came partly from Michael Pollan's book, Botany of Desire. I mean, that was certainly an inspiration. I got really kind of hyped up on that book where he talks about these 4 plants that sort of shaped human civilization as much as we've shaped them. The apple, the potato, the tulip, and cannabis. I don't know. It got me really inspired about this idea that the plants themselves have this story to tell, and that I wanted to do a book that had plants as like the central sort of protagonist rather than a human. And just thinking about reflecting my own life, I don't really have like a green thumb or a lot of direct experience with plants. And then I realized like, oh, wait a minute, I worked for an entire decade in ginseng cultivation. How strange is that? No, and I started working 40 hours a week when I was 10 years old through my summers. And then when I started digging into the actual research about ginseng, suddenly it seemed a very fascinating plant to me.
That is a strange thing about growing up and getting older, that you can just like almost completely compartmentalize a decade of your life. And that it's something that like that you hadn't really reflected on subsequently.
In a way, I get inspired by the boring parts of my life too, because when I did Blankets, I mean, part of the impulse behind that is like, oh, I want to do this really big, long book where almost nothing happens. And it's very boring in a sense and simple, which at that time was not very common in comics to do something that mundane in a way. And this is similar. Like, I don't think I would have thought about, a hot second about growing up doing farm work until I realized like, oh, I haven't seen that done in comics, and suddenly something that's as mundane as is, child labor, agricultural child labor, it becomes more interesting in the comics form. And then this might be a bit of a leap, but I do think that this book is tied abstractly to Trump's election too, in the same way that Habibi was sort of tied to 9/11. There's this processing period living on the West Coast, and then Trump gets elected, and nobody saw that coming, and everybody's kind of devastated and confounded and lost. It made me like, I meditate more on where I came from, knowing that the Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, these 4 states were really what decided that election, and having a sympathy for the sort of these kind of salt of the earth working class people, farmers and factory workers that I grew up around, and just sort of wanting to re-inhabit their mindset to sort of understand to some degree what was happening in our country. And that was an element of this too, of like, okay, I want to go back to, I mean, my upbringing is just these working class people, the exact same people that swayed that vote, the factory workers and the farmers.
Part of what I was getting at with the parent question is there is this inherent, I don't know if tension is the right word, but obviously this juxtaposition of different cultures. There's this, very small town Midwestern culture, and then this product being made for a very, in a lot of ways, completely different culture on the other side of the world that is like slowly seeping into that world to some degree. And this is a very coastal elite view of things, but I think we do kind of tend to think of the middle of the country as being kind of perhaps xenophobic to some degree. And so when I do think of these two different worlds, that to me presents a kind of tension.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this town I grew up in, the population was 1,200 people, and the nearby, like, quote unquote city was 35,000. That's Wausau, Wisconsin. But in the 80s and 90s, it was, I guess, per capita, the whitest city in America. So it is a very sheltered, xenophobic place. But since at least, the turn of the century, in year, 1890s, basically, they'd been growing and exporting ginseng to China. So a very, very kind of homogenous community, but with a kind of longstanding relationship with Chinese trade.
Is your sense that in the same way, because you were exposed to it at a young age, that it was something that, that you didn't really give much thought to? Is that just kind of the way the town operates, that there's been so many generations working with this specific crop that they don't really even think about it all that much?
I guess I can't speak for all those growers. I mean, during the processes of the book, I've been going back and interviewing farmers that I worked for as a child. Most of them have retired from the industry now, and I don't see them having a lot of curiosity about, the actual medicinal side of the crop and the cultural side. And those farmers still use terms like Chinaman all the time, which is a very shocking thing to hear. But the growers now that exist in the town, and they're interviewed in later chapters of the book that I've yet to draw, are big time growers. So it's kind of moved from the small family farm of like 2 acres to mega farms of 500 acres. Just like how farming in general has changed in the US. The family farm, doesn't really exist anymore. It's just these huge corporate mega farms. And so these growers that plant 500 acres, they have a lot more invested in their relationship with the Asian markets. So they're going at least 4 times a year over to Hong Kong and China and Taiwan, and really having more hands-on experience with the markets. And they usually have a large staff that can speak Mandarin and whatnot now. But growing up, it was a different industry, I'm trying to capture both sides of it.
Do you get the sense that they understand why you're interested in it, why this is something that you would interview them about, that why this is something that you're spending, so much time working on?
I definitely, when I started this process of interviews, I think there was a lot of suspicion around what I was doing. And there's kind of industry secrets that people really hold close, close to the chest or whatever, even inside the community. Like one farmer won't know another farmer's methods, or even often where their gardens are located. They're very paranoid about like aerial surveillance of their gardens, almost like marijuana growers or something, because I don't know, like it's a competitive industry. I'm feeling paranoid lately because it's not like an agenda I have, but part of the narrative is a lot about pesticides and the chemicals that are used on the plants. Ginseng's a very delicate crop, and it's really susceptible to all kinds of disease and fungus. Certainly any kind of like crop like that that's being grown in a really dense monoculture is going to have problems with disease. And so it requires like at least weekly pesticide and fungicide applications. And I write about this a lot in issue 5 of the series, about how like technically you're supposed to wait about 3 days before you let the workers in after a spray. But you're doing those sprays on a really regular schedule, once or twice a week. And when we were children, we would go in immediately following a spray. We just wait for the tractor to make its rounds and then go in while all the chemicals were still hovering and the plants were dripping wet with a lot of these chemicals now are not, I mean, they're no longer allowed. And those regulations are changing year by year. But it's a component of the writing that I'm a little nervous because I'm not trying to do like a exposure piece, you know, but it still happens to be part of the narrative.
You're paranoid about calling people out specifically or getting someone in trouble?
I think my biggest fear is I actually honestly do have some pride in the ginseng that's grown in my home community. And I do think there's probably some, they talk about the ginseng grown there as being sort of, being like the sort of Bordeaux wine region of ginseng cultivation. Like there's something really special about the terroir. I can't even say that word, but the terroir, the minerals in the soil, whether, you know, those came from the glacier deposits and whatnot. And I think there might be some connection to the 45th parallel on the globe. But there's something like kind of magic about that geography that creates very specific sought after roots. For instance, my brother and I went on a tour of the Jilin province of China, which is in the northeast part of China, right on the border of North Korea. And that's where all the ginseng is cultivated there. But we would set foot in these towns and people not knowing who we were, other than that we were white Westerners, which I don't think they had seen before in their villages, would run up to us and be like, do you want to see our secret stash of Wisconsin roots? It's obvious that they're very sought after and sort of reverential attitude towards Wisconsin ginseng. On the other hand, I'm aware that there's a lot of chemicals and pesticides put on this crop, which is used for herbal medicine, you know, so there is a contradiction there. I don't know if this is going to be part of the narrative, but like what sort of destroyed the industry in my hometown was in the mid 90s. A lot of the tobacco growers in Ontario were kind of put out of business because the cigarette industry was declining, and they just started to use all of their equipment and land to switch over to ginseng farming. So it was actually the Canadians that started this sort of mega farm version of ginseng cultivation. But the quality of the roots may forever be lower than ours because, in fact, there's actually more regulation on our soil in the US than in Canada, or at least it started here sooner. And so that's really compelling to me too, that when you're growing a sort of really sensitive crop like that, and a root crop, it's extracting things in the soil that are there for hundreds of years. I mean, I think that's why it's also potent in Chinese medicine, because you hear these legends of 1,000-year-old ginseng roots and stuff, and those probably have thousands and thousands of years of soil minerals in them. But whatever's in the soil sticks around a long time. And that's the thing I learned more and more from ginseng farmers too. If someone planted ginseng on a plot of land, 100 years later, they still can't grow ginseng there. There's some residue or transmitters left in the soil that prevents it from being grown there again.
It sounds like one of the biggest problems that you're having with this is figuring out which threads to follow. It almost sounds like an embarrassment of riches. I mean, you know, obviously you've gotten, a number of floppies out of it, but how clear is it at this point in the process what you want to cover and where you want to go with it?
I had a very set deadline or outline when I started the whole project. And I'd say the first 6 issues I had mapped out pretty detailed, like they were pretty well written. And as I get farther in the book, I'm kind of moving more into the territory that I don't have written out yet. I just have the loosest elevator pitch outline. And then the research gets a little more complicated as I go deeper. So In a couple of issues, I have to start going through these interviews I did with Taiwanese pharmaceutical researchers. And I don't know if I can, I don't know what I'll be able to extract from those interviews. There's a language barrier and there's a lot of scientific information. And I don't know how much I'll be able to comprehend alone, but also I don't know how much is really necessary in the end for the sort of heart of the story. So I do like these detours, but I know that the thing that's probably going to suck in the general reader is just that personal element of our childhood experience. Early on, I learned that when I started researching the book and I was describing to people what I was working on, I could see their eyes glaze over. Then when I would say, but I worked in ginseng for 10 years when I was a kid, starting when I was 10, then they were invested. So I do recognize that's really the through line, the red thread that ties it all together. It's just following my brother and I through our youth doing this childhood labor.
The closest analog I can think of in comics is Kevin Huizenga's stuff.
I love his stuff.
And he, obviously Glenn Ganges is his primary character. And I think he does probably some of the best, or perhaps the best science stuff in comics. The stuff he does about, trees or animals, nature is great. But like, he does always have Glenn Ganges as a kind of an anchor or a centerpiece or something that he can go back to. Do you see your own story serving a similar role?
I hope so. He's definitely an inspiration. He's much smarter than me. I envy his, he's an amazing writer and much more articulate. But yeah, I would, I'm also a big fan of Moby Dick, and not to put this project on that level, but I am drawing some inspiration from that model.
I love how you're like, I don't know if I'm as good of a writer as Kevin Huizenga.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm writing the second great American novel, but no, I think Moby Dick is such a fun book to read. I know Jeff Smith is a huge fan too, and again, there's a sort of a genius level writer who's like just able to write so articulately about all these different subjects. But I like that the book, it has this emotional through line, but then it just has all this freedom to just detour and go really, kind of off the rails for a while in the science and whatnot.
I think I'm about like 4 or 5 or 6 books deep right now in the reading, however many Tom sent. Do you get the sense that you're naturally kind of drawn away from your own story as you're writing this, as you're pulling those threads?
That's a good question. So issue 6 is very much, that's like the issue that I felt was kind of like blankets 2, which is always the joke that's what the readers actually want, is blankets 2. And that one I wrote a lot more about like more personal stuff and some religious stuff and a lot of teenage angst. Every issue is completely challenging in its own way. So, and it's very similar to like with my books in general. Like when I finish a project, I'm so sick of the subject matter and the drawing style and I just want to do something completely different with the next book. And now I'm finding that at a more accelerated rate. By the time I'm finishing a 30-page issue, I'm just like, oh, this is a disaster, and I hate whatever the theme of this issue is. And then I go into the next issue being like, okay, I'm going to go off in a totally different direction. And I by the time I reach the end of that one too, I'm kind of sick of it again.
Like, it's not your first book, but really, hugely popular and probably to this day, the one that people most closely associate with you. Do you feel like that at a relatively early stage in your career, doing that book and having it be as popular as it was a bit of a double-edged sword for you?
I don't know. No, I don't think so. Because I didn't really get, I as successful as that book has gotten, I didn't get this sort of immediate success that, say, a graphic novelist will today or has. I didn't hit the sort of success as, say, a Raina Telgemeier or someone of her caliber. I had worked, by the time that book came out, I had worked at least 20 different day jobs, so I had pretty much a whole lifetime of career before, up in front of me or behind me. And also like the book it was selling well, but I wasn't getting paid for those copies for so long that it didn't change my financial lifestyle. Yeah, but I guess it's truth that like I haven't had another hit on that sort of level.
to have that level of success with a book that was that personal? Was that part of the reason why you felt that you wanted to move away from memoir?
Yeah, for sure. Because when I was working on blankets, I didn't think anybody would see it. And that gave me a lot of freedom. And I do think that's the strength of that book, is that I was naive and sort of pure. Like, I did not feel the audience's like gaze upon what I was doing. And so it was very free, you know. And then afterwards, you know, I had all kinds of fallout, whether that was like sort of like my family, my parents specifically being upset, me needing to learn how to like have boundaries with readers. You know, that was something that was a learning process. Yeah, it was just sort of, and also, I don't know, I never had that sort of innocence again of not being aware of the readership. When I went into my next project, which was Habibi, I had definitely had that sophomore slump sort of energy of like, oh, there's all this expectation now. There's this performance anxiety, which I didn't have prior. But also, yeah, like once I learned that people are actually looking at it, I didn't feel like as comfortable revealing my personal life. And I think with the Ginseng Roots, it's nice because I'm reflecting on basically something that happened 30 years ago. But I don't know if I could do a Carnet de Voyage, for instance, which was a real-time memoir. I couldn't do like the Joe Matt style, expose what's really happening in my life at this moment. It's easier when it's reflective, like decades past.
In a lot of ways, I don't think you necessarily have a lot of Joe Matt in you when it comes to writing comics. There might be a degree of it in some of the books, you know, of being like hyper personal, but you know, he is one of those. And there are a number of cartoonists who are like this, who are personal to such a fault that it can almost feel like maybe they're putting like too much of themselves on the page.
I respect that, though. I like it. I like the awkward discomfort of a Joe Matt comic. I'm eager to read Adrian Tomine's new book, it's this damn pandemic. I need to just get online and order it, but I miss so much just walking over to my shop and picking up the book I want, you know. But have you read that one yet?
I have, yeah. No, I had him on the show too.
Okay, I got to listen to that interview.
It's a very high bar, but it might actually be my favorite book by him.
That's exciting. Yeah, and knowing that's out there, just the idea of it excites me. And so, yeah, I want to see that sort of awkward, personal, hopefully some cringeworthy sort of personal stories out of Adrian, you know, and getting back to some of that vibe of his mini comics era too.
What's the hang up about Carnet de Voyage of doing something that you're not that far removed from?
Well, in a way that was at the time kind of the most fulfilling of my books because it was so raw and unedited. I just did it in 2.5 months versus years and years of labor. It was a very off the cuff book. So I'd love to get back to that way of drawing with that sort of loose ease. Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to expose my real-time private life in that way. When I was on that trip, you know, I spent a lot of time with Louis Trondheim in Montpellier, and he was telling me about Johan Sfar and how he basically lost all his close friends because everything that, you know, happened with them, he would take their personal stories and put them directly into his comics, which makes for compelling comics, but it was not great for friendship. And in the course of this conversation, Louis started like kind of telling me some personal stuff that I found really profound. I was like, oh man, this conversation got deep. And I did want to draw it later that night. I went back and I'm like, I got to draw that. And then I realized like, oh wait, that was Louis's story. He told me something really personal. I can't put that in a book, you know? So right away I was running into that sort of wall with the real-time memoir of like, oh, okay, the best stuff is kind of part of other people's stories. And I don't have the right to make that public.
It's one thing to expose all of yourself. Like that's absolutely your right and privilege to do it. It's crossing a different line entirely when it comes to, you know, people who are in your life, especially like people who like didn't necessarily sign up to be in your life. Do you feel, is there any regret with regards to how much of your parents you put into blankets?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of regret about it. And it exists in this new book too. It's very frustrating when I'm trying to depict these, you know, these real experiences, you know, and being aware that they're also like, I don't know, manipulating the memory and you know, all documentary is a very contrived medium anytime you're just taking real life and patching it back together, editing it in a new form, it gets manipulated. So yeah, I'm not comfortable with that. So yeah, so I remember having a conversation with a cartoonist friend about how he thought that autobio comics are the easiest to make, but the least fun to read. But I think the reverse equation is true. I think they're the most difficult to make, but they're really fun to read. And so it's just that juggling act. But yeah, it makes me uncomfortable depicting my parents. It makes me uncomfortable depicting all these farmers. I mentioned earlier that some of these farmers were using jargon like Chinamen. That made me really uncomfortable. I was talking with this to a friend about this, and they said, well, are you going to put that in the book, right? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to put that in the book. And they're like, why not? And I'm like, well, I don't want to throw those people under the bus. I don't want this to be a kind of gotcha journalism thing. I'm not trying to do Sacha Baron Cohen. If somebody says something embarrassing, I don't want to capitalize on that. And they had the opposite attitude. They're like, but you have to expose this wrong they're doing, then only then can they maybe become more self-aware about stuff like that. But I just don't feel like that's my job with this project.
There must have been hesitation on their part when you told them that you were doing another book about growing up and something that they would potentially play a role in.
Yes, definitely. I write about this a bit in issue 2 of this series, about how when I was back home for a ginseng festival, everyone seemed kind of eager to talk about ginseng until they learned that I might be doing a book about it. And then suddenly the stories just stopped instantly. And my mom was like, nope, I can't remember anything about working in the ginseng. And like a minute prior, she was, they were flowing out of her. But my mother doesn't remember anything about her childhood. So that's something I'm processing too, I think, with this project, because I don't really know. I didn't really know my grandparents, both on my mom and dad's side. I've probably met them 2 or 3 times total. And on my mom's side, I really know nothing about her family. I don't know what her parents did for a living, for instance. And so there's just a big gap. There's something missing in knowing where I actually come from, because my parents, when they became born again Christians, they really divorced themselves from their families. And the weird thing is I'm working on the ginseng book, which I can tell they have some discomfort with. Somehow it also starts to extract their own childhood stories from them. So for the very first time in my life, I'm hearing my mom say some random thing about her father here or there, which I've never previously known nothing. So there's something to that. I don't know how to explain it though, but it is kind of like what I say. Another thing about autobio is I think when you're reading someone's personal story, it kind of helps you access those sort of locked rooms within yourself too. Like you suddenly start like unlocking little doors of your own experience.
In the same way that you're trying to keep, how far down any of these rabbit holes you go in check when it comes to the ginseng, do you similarly have to keep these family stories in check?
So far, I haven't been keeping them too much in check. So issues 2 and 6, I think like some of the more personal family stuff really comes to the foreground. And that's not a conscious desire, that's in spite of myself. I sort of resist that from happening, and then it bubbles up and happens in the book anyway.
How did you talk them into, to some degree, participating in this book again after what happened with blankets?
I don't think I was trying to manipulate them. My sincere directive with this project was to write about ginseng and have ginseng be the central protagonist.
Sure, but there must have been some degree of you like having to bring them back into the fold, of like them feeling like perhaps they had been burned, or at least like not really appreciated the process of having a book about them being out there. There must have been some convincing on your part that they weren't going to go through that again. Yeah,
well, I mean, my intention, and we'll see what happens, but my intention is not to get overly personal with this. So we'll see how that pans out. Also, part of the choice to serialize is I was hoping in serialization there would be a much more of a call and response quality to the writing. I thought like, I could write a chapter and release it to the public, and then someone would come out of the woodwork and add or refute what I was doing that could take the book in a new direction. I wanted it to have that sort of redirect potential. And the same applies to my parents. I was like, if I put out an issue and they dislike it, maybe the follow-up issue is them retorting and correcting the information from their viewpoint. neither of those things have necessarily materialized yet, but that's embedded in my desire to do serialization. Like, well, what if it gets to autocorrect itself in real time as I'm writing and drawing it?
I had heard you talk about this a little bit with regard to drawing somebody with a NASCAR shirt on. They felt like it wasn't something that represented like who they were.
Yeah, I can explain that. So in issue 5, I interviewed some childhood friends who are doing ginseng farming now, and I heard that they were unhappy with their representation, and that perhaps I made them look like hicks. And I felt terrible. But on one level, I'm like, well, I guess I do kind of think of everyone that comes from my hometown, myself included, as being kind of hicks, you know?
It's a small farm town.
And but apparently they don't have any fondness for NASCAR. They just happen to be wearing like a beater NASCAR shirt because it was a shirt that they could get dirty out in the ginseng. And now they're like, oh, now I'm depicted forever having this NASCAR shirt. So maybe I correct that for the final graphic novel edition. On the other hand, I don't think the reader is necessarily going to judge someone because of their NASCAR shirt. But yeah, I heard someone, like a reader, respond to how I was depicting some of the people at the Wisconsin Ginseng Festival, and they thought like it was very reverent towards the Asian tourist, but it was very satirical of the Wisconsin natives, for instance. And I'm like, well, that's not my intention either. I mean, like, it's the problem. I know Joe Sacco talks about it all the time. Whenever you're like trying to translate what you're looking at in cartoon form, some of it's going to come off as caricature. And part of the fun is caricature. I know that Joe has over the years has felt more bogged down by having to dial everything in precisely. You start to veer into photorealism, you know, and you lose that sort of vitality of cartooning. So he would love to get back to sort of the Palestine era, like caricature he used to do.
I spoke to him a week or two ago about his new book, and it very much sounds like he has to fight against his instincts in order to do that repertoire style. Obviously, you know, you have a specific style. You're not trying to draw things photorealistically.
Yeah, I love Joe's new book, Paying the Land, a lot. But I did pull out Palestine recently, and there's a vitality to that book, you know, that does start to disappear in later projects because he's being so precise in the realism of everything. You know, like I do miss the cartoony elements in his older work. But yeah, for me, I don't really have a choice. Like everything kind of is this weird hybrid of you know, maybe because I draw with a brush, you know, like you can't get too photorealistic.
And again, you've got a very signature style, but also you're making very conscious choices to have like a talking cartoon ginseng root.
Yes. Yeah, that was I don't remember when that happened. I think in a way that part of that was wanting to tap again my original intention to have the ginseng itself be the central character. But I think it was also looking at maybe manga or something like that and being very envious of like when they have these little like iconic cartoon characters, you know, like I have a fondness for that sort of Dr. Seuss, like, you know, Lorax character. That's actually what I was probably tapping the most with my little ginseng root. Also, I was reading a lot of the ginseng root legends from China and Korea. And they always involved, you know, that little ginseng coming alive and running through the forest. And I think I was illustrating one of those tales, and I just got really attached to the character, you know. But I don't know. That's a strength of cartooning and comics, I guess, is being able to have that sort of fantastical thing. And those are probably the funnest sequences to draw.
You're not wedding yourself to realism. You're not forcing realism on this, that you're able to do that.
Comics would be a bad medium for real, straight realism, really.
But, you know, versus again, what Joe is doing, you know, obviously, like, you know, he takes liberty. And as I discussed with him, like, he still very much draws himself as a caricature, you know, even though everyone else around him is realistic. But you're obviously, in this case, less interested in that. I wonder how much of that is knowing that this is a project that you're going to be working on for a long time. So you're trying to give yourself ways that, you know, you're going to kind of recapture some of that joy of the process of creation.
Yeah, that's it probably precisely. Is I'm always trying to figure out how to recapture the joy of comics. Certainly for, at least the past decade, you know, like everything I do is like, how do I make this enjoyable again, because it's been a long time that, that it's not easily enjoyable.
Has it not been enjoyable over the past decade?
I mean, the longer you're in the industry, it's very easy to get cynical, just to see the way that like authors are exploited. And so like, it seems like everybody around them profits except for the authors themselves. So I think it's just that's a part of it, just seeing a lot of the sleazy side of the industry, And then, I've had a lot of health problems over the years too. So drawing has been a real challenge, but it's been a challenge since the Carnet de Voyage era, as far as like getting my hands to operate and stuff. I know a lot of cartoonists talk about similar sort of things, but when you're drawing as a child, it's just a very instinctual, joyful sort of hobby. And once it becomes your job and you're doing it 12 hours a day, it becomes a bit of a drag. So there's always a way, I don't know, always trying to find a way to make it fun. I heard your interview with Dan Klaus where he, someone on that sort of echelon, like talking about, like how like year by year, you're kind of trying to figure out, can I keep doing this? Is this sustainable? It's a very hard, difficult way to make a living. Should I find, and I was in Los Angeles for a while and just seeing how people thrive in the animation industry, at least financially, it's very enviable from the comic book artist's standpoint.
There are the pragmatic issues of trying, obviously, like just trying to make a living at it. There's the health issues. Is it carpal tunnel?
No, I have a bunch of I don't even want to get into my health issues, but I have some pretty mangled hands. So and they've been kind of getting messed up since my 20s.
You touch on a little bit in the book. I don't know if it's related, but there is a scene where the doctor basically says he's injured his hand by drawing too much. This is something that goes back pretty far.
Yeah, I have. Since I was in third grade, I've had a lot of issues with my hands, actually. And I don't know if there's a correlation, but, I was also working for 40 hours a week in pesticides, so some of those pesticides cause all kinds of deformities.
Doing manual labor, I'm sure, is also probably pretty difficult on the hands.
Yeah, it's probably the combination, the weeding where you're like, up so close and just grinding those chemicals into your hands. I'm sure they can have some detrimental. I mean, a lot of field workers in America, that's mostly Latino workers, have a lot of these same issues. They're slow with releasing the studies, but there's definitely some correlation.
Is the actual process of making a comic, is the process of drawing when your hands aren't aching, is that still enjoyable?
There's parts that are enjoyable. Like I really love the earliest stages that are just sort of brainstorming in a sketchbook. That's the closest experience to like drawing as a child, is really just drawing for my own consumption. Sketchbooks in general are very fun. I think that's the pleasurable side of being a drawer. So after the sketchbooks, the most fun process in comics making is the thumbnailing. That's sort of like the loose drawn version of the book. And that's when you're kind of breaking down all the layouts and the panels and the real mechanics of comics making. And but it's loosely drawn, there's nothing like labored over yet, so it's just the rhythm of the comics. It's like the notation, and that part's fun. But then like the rest is kind of like my painter friend compares it to mowing the lawn. It's this laborious process of executing the final pages and getting things right.
Granted, I live in New York, so I haven't mowed a lawn in a long time, but it could be a meditative process. I mean, it can be enjoyable.
Yes, you're right. No, there's that too, though. And there's still a compulsion to do it. When I'm not writing or drawing, I have a different kind of anxiety that like, I want to be back at the drawing table. So then you get to the drawing table and then you're miserable in a different kind of way. But, there's definitely a compulsion to do it. And then, so I guess I was going to say like the third part of the pleasure. So if like the sketchbook phase is really fun, the thumbnails, there's a lot of satisfaction there. Then it's a lot of just hard labor in between. The release of a book can be super painful, but some of the travel is very fulfilling. So being able to travel around the world and realize that the book has connected to a wide audience, that's really fulfilling. And feeling the work connecting to a wider audience. Comics is very lonely work, like people have been complaining about pandemic isolation, but that's sort of like the reality that cartoonists live in all the time. A lot of my friends now are contacting me like, no, now I get you. Now I know what you're talking about. Like, this sucks being trapped inside alone for 12 hours a day,
Obviously, you've worked out this great deal with Tom at Uncivilized where you're serializing it. And as somebody who is like, when you do put out a book, you put out a lot of, or a couple of really massive books that obviously just, sucked up like 7 or so years of your life. You found a way to short circuit that process in an interesting way in terms of like getting feedback and being more social and just, meeting it out and breaking it up into chunks. And I wonder, you talked about this a little bit with regards to Carnet de Voyage, that you were able to sort of tap into that kind of loose style. What's standing between you and putting something that's a little more direct or a little more sketchy out into the world?
That's a great question. I was really hoping this book would look like Carnet de Voyage, but it just doesn't. I don't know. It's not like created on the fly in that sort of way. And yeah, they're just different beasts. But no, ultimately, whatever comes after this book, I want to try to get back to that sort of Carnet de Voyage. That's what I'm always reaching for, is that spontaneous style.
It's an issue of letting the content dictate the style then?
No, I don't know if that is it, because I would love for this to be more loose, and I tried early on drawing loosely. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a direct answer. My instinct is to say like, oh, when I'm happier in life, I'll be able to work like that again, but I don't know.
How much has the pandemic affected your work?
Pandemic really hasn't changed the work at all. Like it is basically the same lifestyle. And I was making zero money beforehand, so making zero money now is also the same. It changed my life in the sense that like I was living alone in Portland and because I couldn't have a social life, usually I was, I'd work like 12 hours a day and then go out every night and spend time with friends. And because that stopped, I couldn't really sustain the living alone thing. So that's why I came out here to Minneapolis to live with my brother. And that's been amazing. I love living with him. And, and because we're collaborating on parts of the book too, it helps in that way too.
It's not an experience we necessarily get a lot with comics. Obviously there's a lot of people out there doing autobiography and doing memoir and comics, but this is a really interesting opportunity in that you are not only returning to memoir, but are like quite literally going back to the same period of your life. And you very much, you break down the fourth wall and you draw attention to the fact that your sister was left out of blankets. Obviously, like, she was a really big part of your life growing up, even if you weren't necessarily as close to her as you were with your brother. But for me as a reader, one of the most fascinating things beyond all of the Ginseng content is watching you kind of reveal the stuff that you didn't reveal or that you chose to leave out in that first book.
Yeah, that was a way of exposing, the sort of problems with autobiography, or exposing, the sort of fictions that happen when you're trying to work this way. So I wanted to be transparent in that way. And I just had like a sort of random thought as you were asking me that question about, I was just complaining about, like how I don't really enjoy making comics anymore. And that was a big impulse for this project too, is sort of meditating on labor and thinking about, this, like I grew up with a really strong work ethic, like this sort of Midwestern attitude that like you're not even supposed to do fulfilling work. People don't pursue fulfilling work where I come from. It's just the sweat of your brow for the sweat of your brow's sake. That's its own reward, the sort of torture of hard labor. I realized like, oh, I've been doing this for so long that I'm totally spoiled and I take it for granted that this was my dream, to be able to hide inside from all the elements of weather and just doodle for a living. I can step outside of myself and see that, this is an ideal scenario, but I kind of wanted to like go back, revisit the more hard labor I used to do and the work ethic that went along with that. I don't know. I think that those sort of qualities are kind of going away in general in probably American culture. And I don't place a judgment on that one way or another. But it's something I'm meditating on with this project.
Maybe you don't necessarily pass judgment on it as it pertains to like society or other people, but somewhere I read or heard you describe it, I don't know if this is a paraphrase or direct quote, but as working class guilt, which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it. I mean, is that something that has been pervasive for you throughout your career of making comics, or is that something that you're really just starting to grapple with again now?
I have a lot of working class insecurity and lack of confidence, basically, because I never graduated high school. My education ends pretty early on, and then I just was thrown into the workforce. So I have a lot of insecurity about my sort of lack of, academic background. And I sort of have stumbled my way to this privileged, spot where, I get to make a living in the creative arts. And then my peers are people from creative circles and academic circles and whatnot. And then, I guess so there's definitely a working class insecurity that there's an imposter syndrome that like, I'm not like these people. I didn't come from education or other forms of privilege, And so I'll just be exposed as the hick, there's that term again, that I actually am.
That's not something that subsides or goes away after the fourth or fifth or sixth book?
No, it seems to get worse, I think, because you can't really shake to some degree where you come from. So I'm kind of just trying to reconcile that a bit. But yeah, the working class guilt too is like I have always kind of felt too like what I do is not real work, because I know what the sort of hard labor stuff is. And, I'm very not, I'm not very manly in that sense of like doing, and even as an adult, I don't do any of those I don't have any of those real tangible manly skills, fixing cars and, doing construction. And a lot of my friends do, and so I do feel insecurity around that too.
Not that you were ever hiding where you came from or what you did, but this is a way of just showing people like, hey, this is this is who I am, and this is me, and this is where I came from. Maybe imposter in the sense that you didn't your experiences are different from them, but certainly not in the sense of trying to hide your past.
Yeah, I don't think I do. I don't think I try to hide my past. And the reason I'm getting sidetracked too is because it's like what I'm trying to untangle in the project. So I don't really have the answers yet, hoping on the other end of this, I can be more articulate in an answer.
What's the hang up here specifically?
I just don't, I think the books that I work on, I never really quite know what I'm writing about. I have like a vague theme, but it's not until I emerge on the other side of the tunnel that it's like, and maybe that's normal for most authors. Maybe not screenwriters. Screenwriters are supposed to know what the end of the book, the story is, and then work backwards, and then have their clear 3 acts or 15 story beats, etc. But for me, it's much more of an exploration, and there are always things that I don't really know how to articulate any other way. So, like Blankets was a coming out project to my parents about my fall from Christian faith. And it was really the only vehicle I knew for expressing those things. I didn't have any of the verbal skills or conversational skills to talk about it. I only had comics to express it. And the same with this project. I have these kind of themes around, labor and class, agriculture and pharmaceuticals, et cetera, but none of them are articulated thoughts yet. And sometimes that doesn't really happen until post-publication. I'm like, oh, that's what I was doing. I didn't realize it.
That must be exacerbated by the fact that it is serialized and it's kind of in the process of changing as you're writing it because you are doing adjustments. So you must have even less of an idea than usual what the overarching theme is.
Yeah, and I do try to just focus on those 30-page issues in front of me. So hopefully it doesn't come off being disjointed, because in a way, the other concerns in the broader story kind of fall away as I'm just dialed in on an issue. And I've never worked this way either, where I have to conserve page count. Most of my books are pretty sprawling, and if I want a chapter be 100 pages, that's what I do. But now I have this very specific constraint of the 30 pages. And so, yeah, that demands enough of my concentration, just trying to figure out how to like shoehorn what I want to fit into a chapter into that limited page count.
You definitely feel like you're on the right track here with this book.
No, never. I never feel like I've never had confidence in any project I've ever done.
Less or more so than usual here?
To me, it seems like less, but when I talk to those around me who have been around through each book, they're like, no, you're always like this. You always think that you're just making a total piece of garbage, you know? And so, yeah, it's pretty much my, so that's part of it too. I mean, I need to have some sort of like total shift of attitude in general towards what I do. I've spent like 20 years just thinking that everything I draw is complete garbage. At some point that has to shift, you know, I have to be more acceptant of myself and the work so that I can enjoy it like I did when I was a child.